What an awesome chapter, though. Chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews. Remember, at the end of chapter 10, the author of the book of Hebrews told the Hebrews, he said, quoting an Old Testament passage, he said, "The just shall live by faith." And he leads up, that's the lead up to chapter 11. Chapter 11, he starts off with one of the classic definitions of faith. That you can see that in 11 verse 1, that it's the evidence of things not seen. We get another little definition of what faith is in verse 3 or so. But then at the end, he ends in those first couple of verses, he says, "By it the elders obtained a good testimony." And then he's going to spend the rest of the chapter basically, for the Hebrews' sake, he's going to list off what would be their heroes: Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and even Rahab and others down through the chapter. He's going to mention some judges by name. He's going to mention prophets by name, and he's going to imply some things about some different prophets. And we went through one of those last week, and that was Abel. It was Abel. And at the last thing I pointed out when we were talking about Abel was that if we learn anything from Abel, it's that God sees our acts of faith. It was by faith that Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. God saw his faith and accepted his sacrifice. And not only does he see our acts of faith, but just like Abraham, just like Abel, just like Moses, he accounts those acts of faith as righteousness. And that's a good thing, because that's where our righteousness comes through. It comes through faith. Not only that, the other thing we can learn from Abel, because it says that his works speak today, is that the long-lasting effect on those around us that our faith can have. And so as we go through these chapters, as we go through this chapter, and I was hopeful that we were going to get through it today, but I looked at my notes and we're not going to get through it today, he said sheepishly. But as you go through these, what I think is best is, and what I think the Hebrew author wanted the Hebrews to do, is put themselves in the place of these men. And as we go through it, you should do the same thing. We're going to talk about Enoch tonight, and we're going to talk about Abraham, we're going to talk about Sarah, and possibly Moses if we get that far. But what I think we should be doing is we should be putting ourselves in their place. Abraham did some great things. Two things that are mentioned in this chapter is that he left Ur of the Chaldees and went to a land that he wasn't familiar with, and a land that God would give him. And what's common throughout all of these is, you'll find out, is that all of these folks were obedient to what God asked them to do. God told them to do something, and they did it. And so, and we'll see the same thing with Noah. Noah obeyed every command that God gave him. And so put yourself in the shoes of these people of faith, these men and women of faith, and put yourself in there and ask yourselves as you're going through, would I have been faithful like Noah was faithful? Would I have been able to give up the riches and glory in Egypt like Moses did? Would I be able to go on a journey if God asked me to? These are the kind of things that we need to get our own minds around. We need to be solid in our own faith. And so as we go through these, and these are just wonderful examples, keep those things in mind. So let's go to chapter 11, verse 5. And the text says, "By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony, that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." Now, verse 6 is a very important verse. I think it's probably one of the most important verses in the whole chapter. And again, keep that in mind with the argument that the Hebrew author is doing here. He's giving them all these examples. He's told them not to forsake the assembly of themselves together. He's telling them to live faithfully, because the just live by faith. And he gets here and he says, without faith, it's impossible to please him. Now we'll cover that a little bit. But in this one verse here, it mentions another Old Testament hero, and that's Enoch. And if you go back and look in Genesis 5, it's right there on the screen. Genesis 5, verses 21 through 24. Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. If you go back and look at that, you'll find out that that was highly unusual, that he begot Methuselah so young in his life. And we look at that and say 65 isn't very young. But in this case, in the age of the patriarchs at that time, that was young. So he begot Methuselah. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And so we have these two passages here, verse 5 of chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. And there is another mention of Enoch in the book of Jude. And there is a couple of odd mentions of him, just as his name, if it is this Enoch in the Old Testament. This is all we really know about Enoch, and yet reams of paper have been written about him. In Jude, it talks about the writings of Enoch, and lo and behold, now that you can go on the internet and you can look up the book of Enoch. When was that written? Not before the first century. Definitely not in the time of Enoch. It's not the oldest book in the Bible. It's not even a book of the Bible. It's a made up book. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on that was written in that book, that man-made book, not that Bible book, that you can go out and you can spend years going down that rabbit hole if you want. But this is what the Bible says about it. This is all the Bible says about Enoch. And the most important thing is that Enoch walked with God. Now, the Genesis account here, it says, well, the Genesis account says, Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. Now, that's a little bit ambiguous. It just says that God took him. It's the Hebrew account that adds a little bit of additional detail there. What I find interesting is, and if you don't do this when you're doing your Bible study, when you run into a word here, now, if you run into a word, sometimes it's helpful to see that word in different translations. And so I've got that here, the English Standard Version, the King James Version, the New American Standard Version, the NIV, which is an okay reading Bible, but I don't like to have it for Bible study, and the New King James Version. They're all a little bit different here, but when I grew up, when I first became a Christian, it was the King James, and it is by faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death. But you can see there on the screen the bolded words. ESV says taken up. The King James Version says translated. The NASB version, New American Standard Bible, says taken up. The NIV says taken from. The New King James says taken away. What's interesting, there's a Greek word that means to change or to transfer to another place. And it's the same Greek word we see in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12, which I don't have on the screen, but you can go look it up. For the priesthood being changed, of necessity there was also a change of the law. So if you go back and look at that, it's talking about that the law had to change because Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. But it says for the priesthood being changed. And that should give you a clue as to what this word means here. And I've got the Strong's Concordance for it. The definition means to transfer or to change. So when it says he was taken away, it really means that he was changed. So the question I usually think of when I'm looking at this is, what does it mean? It says, by faith Enoch was translated, taken up, taken from, taken away. To where? I look at that and I wonder myself, what does it mean? What does it mean that Enoch did not see death? And that's an additional clue that we see here in the book of Hebrews. In Genesis, it says, and let me pop that back up there. In Genesis, it says he was not, for God took him. But in Hebrews, it says that he didn't see death. And so what does that mean? And there are two schools of thought on this. And I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I do want to talk about a little bit. There are two schools of thought. And one is that he, like Elijah, and if you go back and look at the death of Elijah, I'll put in quotes there, because Elijah was caught up on a fiery chariot. And so it's suggested that Elijah did not see death either. And so there's the two schools of thought, either that God took Enoch and possibly Elijah directly into heaven, or God took, my page is sticking together, or God took them both to paradise, which we would call Abraham's bosom, and that they just didn't die in the way that you and I die. And that could be the case. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 16, verses, and I've got it on my other screen over here, so I'm going to be looking off to the right here. Chapter 16, verses 19 and following. And that's the account of the rich man and Lazarus. And it's pertinent to our discussion here for a little bit. In verse 19, it says of chapter 16 of Luke, it says, "There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuous every day. But there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom." Bill and I were having quite the discussion about this. And really, you can spend a lot of time talking about this idea of Hades or Sheol in the Old Testament. Both of them, one a Hebrew word and the other a Greek word, really meaning realm of the dead or place of the dead. And apparently in Hades, at the time of Jesus, when he told this account of the rich man and Lazarus, there were two parts. And Abraham says there's a great gulf fixed between the two of them. And on the one hand, you have Abraham's bosom, or what we would call paradise. And on the other hand, you have torments, which is a place, as the rich man said, a place full of fire and torment. And so you've got these two different places in this place called Hades. Well, the problem I see with, and the reason I've got that in there, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a problem with that, but I'll get back to it. How would that happen if God took Enoch straight into heaven? He didn't take him physically into heaven, because heaven's not, as far as I understand, it's not a physical place. And so how did that happen? And I think we see that a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul is describing what's going to happen to us when we do die, or when we do go to heaven. That's the way I understand this. When we go from having a physical body to having a spiritual body, he says in verse 50 of chapter 15, he says, "Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does corruption inherit incorruption. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." That includes you, me, Paul, and I think Enoch too. "In a moment and a twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall all be changed. For this corruption must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality." So there's going to come a time for all of us when our bodies, these dirt sacks, these meat sacks, we're not going to have them anymore. We're going to have an incorruptible body. And it's going to happen in the twinkling of an eye. And that's the idea I get that happened to Enoch here, is that he didn't taste death like you or I will taste death, or like Moses tasted death, or like Abel. He wasn't killed. God didn't kill Enoch. He just took him out of this life into a different life. He did it in such a way as that he did not die. So that I look at this, and the words that King James uses, I hate to say it, but I think I like it better. He was translated. He was in this language, this earthly language, and now he's in this heavenly language. Only it's not a language, it's a body. He was in this earthly body, and he was translated into this heavenly body, this spiritual body, this incorruptible body. And he didn't die in the meantime. You and I, we have to die. But in fact, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, it's appointed for men, it is appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment. And that's true for, I can't say 99.9. It's true for everyone but one person, possibly two, that did not die like that. But they are going to see the judgment. Enoch will see the judgment too. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17 says something similar, if you want to look that up. Then those who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds and meet the Lord in the air, and thus we will be with the Lord. That verse and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I think, go together in the same, talking about the same thing, that it's going to be a moment, a twinkling of an eye. That's the idea that I get, that happened to Enoch here. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. So that's the mechanical part of this. But the question I was asked, Bill's got a comment. Bill has a comment, and I can take a drink.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the time to do this. We did some discussion earlier just because it was enjoyable. One thing I think of, okay, where are Enoch? Where is Elijah? And the thing, where's the thief on the cross?
Well, he was with Jesus in paradise, right?
So that's interesting, is that passage says, okay, today you shall be with me in paradise. Now, that doesn't mean he's gone through the process that you were outlining in those passages. He's not raised from the dead yet. So that's going to happen later. But
you mean Enoch or the thief on the cross?
The thief on the cross.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, which may be different than Enoch. Or Enoch could be in paradise too. He just simply didn't die like the thief on the cross went through a terrible death.
Right.
So I'm just saying is that from the thing that I see that the Hades and paradise, not sure exactly where it is, if it's a little part of heaven where you're not raised yet, but there are a few passages, and you mentioned, I think just in passing, did you met like 2 Corinthians 5:1-8, where Paul says it's better to be absent from the body and at home with the Lord. So he was somebody in a couple places that said, it's good for you guys that I can preach and be involved in the work. So I'm glad I'm still alive, but I am torn. I want to be at home with the Lord. And so that apparently happens when we die, not later after we die, after the judgment, but that we go to be home with the Lord when we die. Now, is that heaven? Can you be in heaven if you're not raised from the dead and have a body like you talked about in 1 Corinthians 15? Maybe not. And that happens when Jesus comes back and is judged. And there's so many passages. I know you don't have time, want to have time to go through there. No,
it's a great thing to just think about and ponder, because, and I don't think we'll ever know for sure until we go through it ourselves, right?
Yeah.
I've got a couple of verses here that I'm going to put on the screen in just a second, because I still am asking the question, did Enoch go to heaven directly, or did God take him right up into heaven? And I think the answer to that is no. Now, Mike Franklin had a comment. He said that Enoch lived in such a way that he was ready for the life to come, and that's true. And we'll get to that part of his life in just a second. I just want to answer this other question first. The reason I brought up the rich man and Lazarus and the idea that paradise was in Hades, at least at the time of Christ it was, because Christ had not made his sacrifice. And if you start looking at this with any depth, you'll find that apparently people did not go to heaven before Jesus died. And that's the way that I would understand it. And you can argue with me all you want, and we can have a good discussion on it. Like I said to Bill, I don't think we'll ever know for sure, but that could have and probably did change after Jesus died. And there are two verses over in the book of John that I want to just put up on the screen here that would answer the question, did Enoch go straight to heaven? Did God just take him into heaven? And I think the answer to that is no. And the reason for it is these two verses in John. John 3:13 says, no one has ascended to heaven, but he who came down from heaven, that is the Son of Man who is in heaven. So Jesus is saying no one has gone up to heaven yet. And he's going to be the first of the ones to do that. When he ascends into heaven, he's going to be the first man who has ascended into heaven. And John 14:6, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So could Enoch have gone into heaven? I suppose it's possible that Enoch was completely sinless and that God just decided to take him into heaven. But if that's the case, that would mean that there's a way into heaven without going through Jesus Christ. So again, I look at this and I look at this man Enoch, who was pleasing to God, and God decided not to allow him to taste death. That's the unusual thing about Enoch, is that God took him from one life into the other. Not that he took him into heaven, but he took him from one life into the other. And there's a reason for that. And, you have to ask yourself, was Enoch sinless? Paul turns around and says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Does that include Enoch? And that's the question. We really can't answer that question. But what I would suggest is that if you're looking at this and you think that God took him into heaven, I would suggest that these two verses in John would say that's not the case, that no one comes unto the Father except through me, Jesus said. So that's all I really want to talk about, that part of this verse. I want to get to the next one. It says, before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. And again, I lean towards this idea that God was well pleased with Enoch because Enoch walked with God. And God took him from this earth without Enoch having to die. But the important point here is that it was Enoch's faith in God that pleased God. This idea of walking with God, you've heard it before, right? Going in the same direction, not running ahead, not lagging behind. This idea of walking in the faith or walking with God is not just in this section here. It's a lifestyle. It's something that we do as Christians, or we strive to do with Christians. As Christians, we want to walk with God. We want to be pleasing to God, and we want to do that through faith. And this point is driven home let me go back to the text here. This point is driven home in verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Without faith, remember the end of chapter 10, the just live by faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. You cannot please God if you don't have any faith. And he goes on and gives us really another mini definition of what faith is. We must believe that he is. We have to believe that Jehovah is the living God. This word here, when it says that he is the same word that's used in the burning bush passage in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. When he says, I am that I am, that's the exact same word that's used here in the Greek. He's saying you have to believe that he is Jehovah, that he is the eternal one, that he is the I am. That's a definition of faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is the I am, that he is Jehovah. And we need to believe also that he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Why do you suppose he said this? I think it's because the Hebrews and us need to hear it. They needed to hear it. If they would diligently seek after God, they would find such great rewards in this life and in the next life. They would be laying up treasure for themselves in heaven. That's that idea. That's why this verse is so important in the study of this chapter and of this book. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. You can't get around that. You need to really latch onto that. So Enoch had this testimony that he pleased God. It was his faith. So in that 365 years of his life, it said in Genesis, he lived 65 years and got Methuselah, and then he walked with God 300 years. That seems like a long time to us. Spawn, you have another comment. What's your comment?
Yeah, just adding to what you're saying there, or saying similar things. That I look at that and I think, do I look at Enoch and think, well, this is a guy I can never be like him?
No, but you can be like him, right?
Exactly. That's what I think so exciting about it.
Yes.
I realize we like give ourselves excuses. I do when I don't do what I should. But and I have no excuse. I need to do better. And Enoch, I think he was a normal man. He had sins, but the greatest way you could describe his life is that he trusted God, walked with him daily. Maybe when the challenges of life that come to all of us came to him, he didn't have any doubts that God was taking care. He trusted God. That's why he pleased him. When he saw, the war coming on, he wasn't afraid of it. He just simply trusted God day by day. When he saw the viruses coming down the road, which they had sicknesses back there, they had leprosy. There are a lot of things to be concerned about. I'm glad I don't live back there, at that time, because of the kinds of conditions and, illnesses they had. He trusted God, and that's something we can do. I don't know if God will decide to take us in the same way. I suppose he could.
I kind of do it.
Not impossible.
Right.
But the thing is, I think what we can be more like Enoch, who was very much like Christ. Job was another person who pleased God very much in what he did, even through the hardships he went through. Right. I think a few people like that were really lived daily walking, with God, and we can do that too.
And you really latched on to one of the comments that I tried to put at the beginning is put yourself in this guy's place.
Yeah.
Can I do what he did? And the answer is a resounding yes. You can walk with God. We can walk in the way. Great comment. Thank you for that. Okay, Noah. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So, the account of Noah. It's actually part of it's written down below in Genesis chapter 6. If you want to look up the whole account of Noah, it's Genesis chapter 6 through about Genesis chapter 9. Chapter 9 is when they get out and they build the altar, and God gives them the rainbow. Look down in Genesis chapter 9, verse 13, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. So God, and you can go earlier in the discussion, verse 11, the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way, except for Noah, you'll find earlier it says Noah found grace in the eyes of God because he was a righteous man. And so we've got this account of Noah, and it's in Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of God, and the question is, how did he do that? And it was that Noah walked with God. Look at that in verse 9. It says, "This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God, just like Enoch had." I went and did a genealogical chart one time of this Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 12 or 11, and tried to figure out, answer a question: did Noah know Enoch? Because both of these men walked with God, and the answer to that is that no, Noah didn't know Enoch. He may have known of him, but Enoch had been taken before Noah was born, and so there's no possible way that Enoch could have known Noah. Now, what's interesting is that Abraham could have known Noah, and what's even more interesting is that Noah's son Shem, if you go back and do the math, actually outlives Abraham. We don't think about Noah, and we don't think about Shem after the flood, but they lived quite a while after the flood. Noah lived another 350 years after the flood, and Shem, who was lived to be about 650 years. I can't remember the exact number, but he outlived Noah, obviously, and he outlived Abraham, which is just incredible if you think about it. But these men, again, verse 9, Noah walked with God, and so we've got this verse here, and I asked the question: what kind of faith did Noah have? Again, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of not seen. And I asked the question. It says that by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household. So the question is, what are the things not yet seen? And I think that's either one of two things: rain, and I'll get to that in a second, or a flood that would cover the face of the earth. And I think both of them could be accurate. It's possible, again, that he had never seen rain. If you Google the theory, the water vapor canopy theory, and go back to the book of Genesis, where it says that they divided the firmament, and there was water above the firmament and water below the firmament. You can look at Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground, but a mist came up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. There's a question, I suppose, as to whether or not it had ever rained in Noah's time, or whether the earth was still being watered from the mist coming up from the ground. It's possible, but for sure there had never been a flood of the kind that Noah was preparing the ark for. But that's the kind of faith that he had, right? He had never seen that kind of flood, and yet God said, I'm going to flood the earth. He said I'm going to destroy. He actually doesn't tell how he's going to destroy it here, but we figure that he must have told him at some point. But he says, I'm going to destroy the earth, and you make an ark. And what did Noah do? He made an ark, just like God said. Bill, you have another comment?
Yeah, speaking from the construction standpoint,
Yeah,
about how much faith it would take for me if I were to hear such a thing from God to do that kind of project. I mean, you look at your chart there, people are maybe hopefully looking at that picture. That ark, which was a huge construction site.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, the time and the resources and the money. I don't know about the money. Where did he get all the money for that? God provided somehow the resources for him, but that would take a lot of faith. It's not like building a project today where you've got all this money behind you. Somebody's invested it it's quite a thing. So I just think from that standpoint, that is a huge amount of faith to undertake that project, never having witnessed anything like what God was saying was going to come.
And I think that's the amount of faith that he had. In fact, he's considered a superstar of faith in the Old Testament, right?
Right.
And I've got another verse for that. But you've got a multi-year project. You know how hard multi-year projects are, right? Seeing them at the beginning, you might be all gung-ho at the beginning, but in year 5 or year 10 or year 50 or year 80, how long did it take him to actually build this ark? I don't think it was 120 years. I think that's when God decided that he was going to destroy the earth and that he was going to limit the rest of the time for 120 years. I don't know that Noah necessarily started in year 120 and worked his way down, but you've got this period of time. Where did he get the wood?
Yeah.
It's not like they necessarily had sawmills back then, although they might have. We see that before the flood there were iron workers and stuff like that. But just sourcing the wood, sourcing the pitch for a boat that's a football field long and almost as wide as a football field, and 30 feet, 45 feet tall or something like that. Huge project. And
the thing is too, is how many people of his neighbors were sympathetic to the project and wanted to volunteer to help. They were scoffing him.
Right. And it says in 1 Peter, actually I've got it, 2 Peter, it says that he was a preacher of righteousness. 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 through 5 says, "For God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing the flood on the world of the ungodly." He was a preacher of righteousness. Yeah. So was he part-time carpenter, part-time preacher, or was the fact that he was building an ark and telling people coming up to him, "What are you building this ship for?" And he says, "Because you're all going to die, unless you change your ways."
Yeah.
We don't know what kind of preacher of righteousness he was, but he was. And the faith that this man had to have had to build something this massive at the request of God.
And to preach that long without any response.
Only 8 souls, right?
Oh,
Yeah. 8 souls. Wow, incredible. So that it's in Ezekiel chapter 14, and you can put the slide back up if you want, Jeff. Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 12 through 15. I said that Noah was a superstar of faith. He said, "Son of man, when a land sins against me by persistent unfaithfulness, I will stretch out my hand against it. I will cut off its supply of bread, send famine on it, and cut off man and beast from it. Even if these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver only themselves by their righteousness," says the Lord. He was just an incredibly faithful man, and the faith that it took to do something like this, and again, you need to maybe, if he's so hard to even comprehend as far as our own faith goes, but if you could think about the little things that God asks us to do, like attend services, like care for your neighbor, like preach the word, all the things that God asks us to do, they're not even of the class that God asked Noah to do. God asked Noah to build this huge ark, and he did it. Genesis chapter 6, verse 22, "Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did." God told him to build an ark, and he built an ark. It's not like the old Bill Cosby joke, where he's trying to bargain with God, and it's God said, "Noah, build me an ark, and I'm gonna save. I'm gonna bring animals to you, and you're gonna save them." And Noah said, "Okay." That's the faith of Noah. That's the kind of faith that he had. And so even not having seen such a thing, just a second, Bill, not such a thing as a flood or rain, he believed God. And it says he was moved with godly fear. God said, I'm going to destroy the world. And Noah said, I don't want to get destroyed. I want to be safe. I want my family to be safe. I'm going to build an ark just like you asked me to. He obeyed. And the faith that caused Noah to move with that godly fear, faith should do that for all of us. His faith condemned a world. Does our faith condemn a world? Darkness shines away from the light. Bill, you have another comment before we move on?
Yeah, thinking of, what kind of an environment did he live in that he was still so faithful? Everyone else around him was so unrighteous. Because I think sometimes we complain, well, it's hard being a Christian today. And I go, you got to think to yourself when you make that excuse, oh, come on, what am I saying? It wasn't as bad as Noah's day. Where everybody was, at least you can look around and we have a church full of brothers and sisters trying to do well. And then there's other churches as well. There was no one else but just the same souls. So it's like, it doesn't matter how bad the world is, we can still trust God and please him.
You see stuff all the time about people who are not Christians who do kind acts, selfless acts and stuff like that. In the world that Noah lived in, there was no such thing as a selfless act. Right. Their thoughts were evil continually. So yeah, great point. The end of this verse, it says, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. And that's a big deal too. He was an heir of righteousness. Again, the just live by faith. We become heirs of righteousness because of that faith. The Hebrews needed to become heirs of righteousness again. So that's really all I have. I was going to say that Noah wasn't a Jew, and neither are we, but we are heirs of according to faith. If you want to be a son of God, you have to have faith. The just live by faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. So Abraham and Sarah. So we've got this section here, and with talking about both Abraham and Sarah. Abraham's actually mentioned twice. This is the first time he was mentioned, and he's justified for obeying God and leaving his homeland and coming to the promised land. So verse 8, it says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And then we'll get to Sarah in just a minute. I'll just comment on this. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed. So if you haven't figured it out by now, or got into this understanding, let's be clear. Faith requires obedience. Faith requires obedience. Abraham obeyed. Noah obeyed. You've got this idea that when God says to do something, we just do it. God told Abraham to go out of Ur, and he went. And he stayed a little bit in Haran for a while until his father died, and then he went down into the promised land, the land that God promised him, even though he didn't know where he was going. So that would be like telling someone, well, actually, it's almost like Nicole and Marcus. They decided that they were going to move to Kentucky. Now, they did go to Kentucky first and visit for a weekend, but it would have been like if they had God had told them, you're going to move to Kentucky, and they would have said, okay, let's go, not ever having to been to Kentucky. And Abraham had never been to Sinai or to Palestine, or whatever you want to call it. He had never been to where Israel would become a nation, where the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hittites and and the Jebusites. He'd never been there before. And God said, get up out of your country and go where I'm going to tell you to go. And you know what? He did. I love the fact that Mike pointed out in this James class that faith is living and active. You show your faith by your works. And in this case, Abraham showed his faith by being obedient, by getting up and leaving Ur and going on. So think of the things that Abraham faced when he went to obey God here. He'd have to travel a long distance. It was almost 1,000 miles that he had to travel. I've got another one that says like 950 miles. 1,000 miles, close enough, right? That's a long way to walk. And that's probably how he did it. They probably didn't ride in carts and stuff like that. They may have ridden on camels, but they probably walked. And it was dangerous. I mean, it's not like today. Well, even today, it's dangerous sometimes to walk in certain parts of town. But he got up and he left his country, and they went to Haran. He would be a stranger in the land that God was sending him, that God was giving him. He was leaving the familiar, his friends. He took some of his family with him, but he was leaving his family and his friends behind. And he was pretty old. He was pretty old when God called him. And then when God called him again in Haran, he was 75 years old. So he was pretty old at the time, but he obeyed anyway. He went anyway. God said, get up out of your land, and he went. Now, I just think about Abraham being in Ur and God calling him and telling him to leave. As far as we know, Abraham may not have known too much about God, but he was in a place where he could have known Noah. Maybe that information was passed down to him, but God called him. And in another part of the Bible, we find out that Abraham was called a friend of God. And I believe that's in Romans, where he was justified by faith and is called a friend of God. And so Abraham, through faith, it says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And the thing is that Abraham, while God gave the land to Abraham never actually possessed it on his own. It did come to his descendants, and that's in Genesis chapter 12. One of the things I wanted to point out here too is that faith is patient. Faith waits. God promised Abraham that he would receive an inheritance. And when did he receive that inheritance? He promised him that he would have children. Part of that was that he'd have a land and he'd have a people, and part of it was a city whose builder and maker is God. But God's timetable isn't always our timetable. And Abraham, of course, didn't wait on God long enough, and that ended up with Hagar and Ishmael. But God had a plan, and God had a plan for Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham was faithful in that he waited for the most part. He waited on God, and so it's important for us to think that faith waits. Bill, you have another comment?
Yeah, really what you were saying there, Abraham left that place by faith and went and dwelt in tents all his life. I mean, we think about, he didn't go to a city and build a great house like Solomon did.
Yeah.
He didn't live in that kind of luxury. He was content to do what God's plan was, and that meant living out of tents all of his life.
Right. Excellent point. And I'm going to probably end up here with Abraham, maybe Sarah. But it's hard to say. I've only got 3 minutes left, so probably not. But it talks about the city here. They dwelled in tents, and that's exactly right. Even though it's kind of funny because God promised him that land, and then when he wanted to have a burial place for Sarah, he went and bought part of it, even though it was always already God had given it to him. But he ended up having to go buy it. So God did give the land to him and to his descendants. He just wasn't able to possess it himself. But so God's timetable isn't. But Abraham did dwell in tents, all the while waiting on the Lord. It says here that he was waiting. He waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. I believe this is talking about heaven, the heavenly city. And I have that on another. We'll talk about that actually after we talk about Sarah. This is not unusual though. But one thing I wanted to point out here is that the Old Testament doesn't talk about the afterlife in very many passages. In fact, it's so little that the Sadducees didn't believe that there was an afterlife. There wasn't a resurrection. There weren't angels, and there wasn't really a spirit world. But the Old Testament does talk about it. David talked about it, going to where the child was, the child of he and Bathsheba who died. He said, I can't do anything but prepare myself to go where that child is. He wasn't talking about just the grave. He was talking about an afterlife there. And Abraham here is talking about an afterlife. I just want to point that out here, that he's looking forward to something that doesn't exist in this world. God didn't build a literal city in the middle of Palestine. He's waiting for the city which foundation, whose builder and maker is God, is talking about heaven. I would think it would be, if it's possibly talking about the church, but I believe he's talking about the city that's described in the book of Revelation, or talking about heaven itself. So, like I said, you don't find a huge amount of verses that speak to more than just the grave or Sheol. But here we have evidence that Abraham was waiting for heaven. Did they believe in an afterlife? Abraham did believe in an afterlife. So we're going to stop there. Sarah, we're going to start with Sarah next time, and we'll get through, hopefully we'll get through Sarah and Moses, but I know I've got quite a few pages of notes here. But Sarah is an interesting person. If you want to read forward, it says, by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. It wasn't just the faith of Abraham that brought about Isaac. It was the faith of Sarah as well. And so we'll talk about one of the few women in the Hall of Faith the next time we get together. And I really appreciate your time and your patience as we go through this. But we'll talk to you next time.